Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and recognise their elders, past and present. And I'd like also to recognise all of the people working to restore lost language and knowledge and culture. Pay my respects also to all of the Indigenous people who are joining us today. And I just want to say that we make acknowledgements of country so often that it's easy to tune them out. And we hear them so often, it's easy to tune them out. But we're at a time in Australia's history, our reckoning, where I think it's especially important to stay conscious and to think about what we're saying and why we're saying it. Many of you will have heard in the last weeks that Indigenous staff and students at the University of Melbourne have spoken publicly about their experiences of racism here and failures to provide Indigenous cultural safety. It takes real courage for people to speak out against that, especially when the conditions that cause that are so deeply structural and where there are often so many barriers in place, managerial barriers that make it more difficult. And so I'm really grateful to the people who have taken those steps and who've had that courage. But it's not just up to them. It's up to all of us, I think, to demand that the law school and the broader university uphold its values, its stated values, including the values of equality and academic integrity. And my hope is that this recent experience will finally provide the impetus for us to do so and to provide a path to a truer kind of unity. So on that light note, I'd like to segue to the reason why we have gathered here today as a group, which is talk about some of the really intriguing issues that arise from thinking about creativity in the era of generative AI. It might be that generative AI turns out to be one of the most significant technological developments that we see in our lifetimes. I'm not sure. It's not going to become sentient. So if you're here because you're excited about that, it might be the wrong room. And it's not going to take half of all jobs. I think that fundamentally misapprehends how work works. But it is likely to have really significant impacts across society. And for all of the usual structural reasons, the conversations about this tend to be really siloed. We have the copyright people talking to the copyright people and the tech people talking to the tech people and the artists talking to the artists. But tonight we really wanted to cut across all of that in a conversation that united those groups. So I'm really, really thrilled to have with us tonight Dr. Joel Stern, who's an artist and a curator and a researcher at RMIT. Professor Jane Ginsberg, a copyright expert with such a long and distinguished track record that she really needs no introduction at all. And Jake Goldenfein, who also needs no introduction, but nonetheless I'm going to give him one of my very valued colleagues here at the law school and an expert across AI and other forms of technology and platform regulation. And of course, I'm Rebecca Giblin, a professor here and director of the Intellectual Property Research Institute of Australia, and I tinker around with issues at the intersection of law and culture for the most part. All right, so when we do have discussions about generative AI, even in the context of art and culture, I find the legal discussions to be remarkably colourless. So we're going to start with just a little clip of a current work being shown at ACME by Memo Acton called Distributed Consciousness.
All directions. You are not a separate being from the rest of the universe, but an integral part of it. The I and I am is also a structure of relationships within my body and between my body and the rest.
Okay, Joel, could you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about this piece. We're very lucky to all be showing this piece this week, and a little bit about sort of AI art in general, what's being done and what the potential is.
Sure. Oh, there we go. I was going to ask, am I amplified? But the answer is yes. Okay, it'd be quite hard to work out what's going on from that little video, I imagine. Have any of you actually been to see this work at ACME? a few. Okay, so I encourage you to go. It's super interesting work, Memo Acton. And the work is called Distributed Consciousness. As you can see, it's a multi-channel video work. There's 8 channels of video, and each screen is sort of embedded in this kind of sleek, reflective, sculptural object, kind of like the monolith in 2001, Space Odyssey, but made of mirrors. And the room itself is also mirrored with images reflecting in a sort of prismatic way. And I think that's actually quite important, that it's a work that sort of speaks to refractions, reflections, and mirrors rather than, let's say, the black box in which sort of there's something hidden. It's more there's something kind of reflected, but that's another kind of way of hiding things too, isn't it? It's sort of hidden behind the mirror. And on each of these screens, we see a series of images. There's 256 images in total, and they're all of these magical octopus-like creatures. Acton calls them tentacular critters, and critters is a term that I think he borrows from lots of people. But obviously Donna Haraway, who uses the term critters to speak about more than human intelligences and beings in a non-patronising way. And so the octopus is a recurring motif in AI artworks. There's lots of obvious reasons for that. The decentralised brain and nervous system of the octopus serves as a model for a kind of alien intelligence or a radically non-human intelligence. And this allows us to think about different forms of intelligence, including artificial intelligence. That's the argument that James Bridle makes in his recent book, Ways of Being, that we should think about intelligences in this more pluralistic way. And visually, of course, the many tentacles of the octopus resemble the undersea fibre optic cables and networked architectures of the internet. The images were created using a generative AI system designed by the artist in 2021, before the arrival of publicly accessible tools like DALL-E and Midjourney. And that shows just how quickly things have changed in terms of the access to these modes of production. And I think the stressing of the fact that Acton created his own generative software is probably exemplary of how artists and art institutions are trying to reassert the value of the art object and maintain its difference from other forms of cultural production in an era of generative AI. That the artist not only created this work, but also designed the tool that generated it, rather than using something off the shelf. The images were originally circulated as an NFT collection, and when they were subsequently brought together as an installation, the artist revealed that each image contained an encrypted text hidden within the pixels, and the texts together took the form of a manifesto co-created with ChatGPT, which is a philosophical rumination on consciousness, free will, life, death, art, technology, ecology, economy, and sustainability. And those texts are installed on a number of scrolling LED panels located throughout the room, and are also legible in the form of the spoken narration that you would have heard, which comes in this sort of alien vocoder robot voice that fills the space along with an ambient soundtrack. And this is a very immersive, seductive work, and I think in a lot of ways it's exemplary of contemporary AI art. The influence of science fiction and speculative fiction in the framing of technologies as alien-like and unknowable. The psychedelic aesthetics, which carry on from the techno-shamanism of the 60s, expanded cinema, rave culture, but also earlier traditions like magic lanterns, illusionism, conjuring, occultism, and other supernatural practices. And part of me wonders about these tendencies, the aesthetic association with magic, even down to the big reveal of what was hidden in plain sight, the encrypted texts. And I wonder how we will historicise this kind of work, which is so infused with a sense of wonder at the kind of spectacle of computation. And here I'm maybe just gesturing towards a comparison between distributed consciousness and some of the more explicitly critical works of data-driven art by artists like Winnie Sun, Sam Levine, Antigua Brain, Lauren Lee McCarthy, Sean Dockeray, Tom Smith and Holly Childs, who are in the room here, and other artists who I think are using AI and generative AI in a kind of spectacle of dismantling the apparatus whilst rebuilding it rather than reveling in its magic. So, yeah, I thought it was worth going into quite a lot of detail to explain this work and what underpins it, so that as we have this conversation about, generative AI and cultural production, you kind of are able to hold the complexity of an artwork and its sort of aesthetic world and its mode of production in mind.
And that's really interesting to think about the idea of consciousness, because I think one of the misleading things about AI and generative AI is that it's artificial intelligence, but there's nothing actually intelligent about these systems. It's just they can sometimes generate outputs that appear to mimic intelligence. So if we think of it as predictive statistics in the case of generative AI rather than anything sort of intelligent, then we're going to have a lot less concerns about that Skynet problem and the impending sentience. But I wonder if we were using the word consciousness instead, that people would be less sort of susceptible to fall for that sort of marketing hype. There doesn't seem to be any kind of consciousness to these systems, although, again, some of the increasing sophistication around, especially the text tools and the way that you can interact with them, even that might not be enough. But perhaps we can talk a little bit about the technology so that we're on the same page about the kinds of things that we're concerned with here. Jake, do you want to kick us off? Now, I know that this is Jake, do you mind just starting off by explaining what we mean by generative AI? That's a very big question, but you could just jump in wherever you like.
Kind of sprung that one on me. I wish I had a nice little preparation.
Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, Jake. It's okay. What is generative AI? I think it's important to think about AI as a complex of things. So it is a complex of a series of technological tools, of industrial arrangements and organizational arrangements, and of digital society, digital culture. So in the middle, you have something like the generative AI model, which are typically built on transformer architectures, they're called now. This is a form of deep learning that was first published by Google in 2017, and it's a generative system with a kind of memory, right? So you have this very big deep learning system that's capable of producing statistically probable outputs according to its training. So its training is something like the digital culture, digital society, wherein in order to produce and train these models, you have to aggregate extremely massive corpuses of data into data sets that index something, like in the case of image generating models, something like the relation between image and concept, or in the case of text producing models, things like dialogue and the relationship between text and concept. And they do this through ingesting, huge data sets from, for instance, like Getty AI, so you have images and their captions, or there are organizations like Leon that produce huge data sets of images with text relations. There are also organizations like Common Crawl, which is scraping like text data. So there's there are these gigantic data sets producing these relational characteristics that these technical models can then produce or generate outputs that match a statistically probable output that matches the natural language input. So that's sort of the technical and the sort of the cultural. And then there's the organizational arrangement on top, because we've actually had generative technologies for a long time, but they were never really fit for purpose. The sort of classic example was like the Microsoft chatbot that became a Nazi extremely quickly. But this is reflective of a lot of the problems of any machine learning system, is that it's trained on data produced by society. That data is going to have biases and inherent discriminations, and the outputs can be dangerous in all sorts of ways. So the organizational dimension and kind of like the organizational secret sauce that made these things fit for commercial application a year or so ago was the capacity to filter the outputs and to shape the outputs of these systems into something fit for consumption. And this was done, for instance, by OpenAI with something called reinforcement learning from human feedback. So the raw outputs from the model then encounter another model that has been trained by a huge amount of human labor that has taken the outputs from the model and evaluated that output against something like what would the user of a system want to see? What would they find useful? What would they find informative? What would that, Facebook's model has something called groundedness, which is like how close does the output approximate something in the data set? So i.e. the ground truth on which it's trained, because I think we're probably all aware that these models have a tendency to fabricate information. Some people call it hallucinating, others call it bullshitting, but they fabricate information and present it in a very believable way. And so that's, being able to moderate that tendency is a thing that these post-processing systems do as well.
Yeah, so there's all of these black boxes that are happening in the middle there, and I'm coming up more and more against the moderation ones, where I'll use a prompt and get a response saying, "Oh, we think that might violate the community guidelines," and then you end up you end up appealing that to also an AI bot, and then winning your appeal and being yes and feeling very satisfied.
But I'll just say that they're constantly tweaking that output, that content moderation for strategic reasons, like to satisfy regulatory obligations and to satisfy different communities, like complaints around the fact that these outputs might implicate copyright have meant that various providers of generative models are moderating their outputs to try and prevent that. So the output state, the big models get trained infrequently because it's very expensive, but the filtering and content moderation is dynamic and always in flux.
And so I talked about those silos before, and those of us who are the copyright geeks in the room know that we experience art and culture in a different way to other people. And so when we look at these technologies, we might be asking different questions. And so as Jane suggested just before we began, that it would be good to separate out the technologies a little bit about the issues at the output stage and at the input stage. Jane has joined us just here after 36 hours travel and is very jet lagged, but has assured me she doesn't want any softball questions. So let's see how hard I can put her. Jane, do you want to, maybe we can talk about this together, but do you want to kick us off by just identifying any of those sort of various legal issues at the outset before we dive in a little bit deeper?
Already technologically challenged. There's two different sets of copyright issues. There's the question of the inputs, so all those data sets that were just referred to, and then there's the question of the outputs, which in turn pose two different sets of copyright issues. One is whether the outputs infringe any of the works that were copied in order to create the data set. And then the other, and I think the most interesting question for our immediate purpose, is whether the outputs could be considered works of authorship protectable by copyright. And of course the answer is it depends, as any lawyer will tell you.
Yeah, and so I'd love to delve deeper into both of those as we go. And I'll just mention those input questions. The question really is, well then, is the use of that training data, which is nearly all covered by copyright in most cases, is that itself an infringement of copyright? Because that in training the model that does have copyright invoking acts, so often at least a copy and potentially a transmission as well. But then once the model has been trained, you no longer need access to those original works. It's not like they are stored in the model or anything. The model can then go off and be used and generate these outputs without any further reliance or any further copyright invoking acts. So those are the two sort of big different clusters that we've got.
I would say it's a bit more complex than just discarding the data set once a model is trained, because often model training by a particular organization will happen in partnership with an organization that provides the data set. So all of the lay-on data sets, they don't just kind of disappear And Leon says, we don't violate copyright because we're not reproducing images, we're just providing indexes of URLs. And here's the script to auto-download all those images, but we're not doing it. So, but at the same time, yes, we'll help produce with Hugging Face Stability AI. So the organizational identity complicates these questions of like, what's a model, what's a data set, who's providing what, who's doing what, in ways that make this really, really difficult to regulate, because the organizational identity and who's making the decisions around what is actually happening is distributed throughout these.
You were saying
these
the other
supply chains.
day that sometimes a data set will live in one jurisdiction and the model in another, and the output somewhere else.
You know, I think that's one of the points that I think is really interesting here, is that there's incentives for an arms race among nations. So particularly if we think about the copyright invoking. So if we, again, separate out the inputs and the outputs, when we talk about the output stage, there's lots and lots of tweaks that can be made to help put copyright guardrails on to prevent anything that is an output from being too similar to anything that's in the training data. And we're seeing those developments being rolled out faster and faster and ever more impressively at the moment. So if we think that perhaps then the main copyright invoking acts are going to be the input stage, that gets really interesting because of that, the fact that you can sever the training of the model from the use of the model jurisdictionally. So if that happens in one country, and there was English language reporting at least suggesting that in Japan they've said that you can train models without any copyright infringement there. It might be that their incentive is to encourage companies to come and invest in Japan and provide that sort of work in Japan. And then the model's released out into the world. And Japan was a country that's had its anime and manga ripped off for many, many years by Western countries. Most of
So this is revenge.
The art and culture that's of interest in these commercial models at the moment is English language. So yes, they might actually quite enjoy that. So yeah, it raises really interesting questions. And certainly the UK IPO, when it was doing an inquiry last year about how they should be treating AI and whether the copyright exceptions should be changed, was even suggesting broadening the existing text and data mining exception on the grounds that they wanted to encourage investment in their country. So that's an extra interesting dimension.
Yeah.
There was a huge pushback in the UK.
There sure has been, yeah.
By the artists. And in fact, the reports from Japan, I have to say, are somewhat ambiguous. Because the ripping off of the manga is also done domestically. And so Japanese artists are not entirely thrilled about the extraordinarily liberal text and data mining law that went into place recently. Unlike other countries, the EU, Singapore, that also have text and data mining exceptions to copyright law, Japan does not require that the data have been acquired lawfully, which is quite a big deal. And I think that's one reason why the Japanese artists themselves are not so happy about this law. There's also an interesting question whether the law, which, as Rebecca indicated, was designed to promote startups and entice business, has actually succeeded in that goal. And it's not clear that it has.
I mean, it's so complicated because you even have companies like OpenAI, who everyone now knows is a commercial operator selling ChatGPT and DALL-E. And none of the production of like image to text generative outputs would be possible without the OpenAI clip model, which when you look at the model card for that says this is a research output for the research community, i.e. we're availing ourselves to the research exceptions in copyright law, which is peculiar for OpenAI to claim when they're using it to produce a commercial product. But in order to produce clip, they used the YFC 100M image database, which Yahoo created by scraping Flickr. And which then IBM synthesized, synthesized into a group of very commercially valuable data sets, all of which were permissible either through research exemptions to copyright or particular readings of Creative Commons licenses that enabled them to scrape these things. So like the organizational relations, the relations between commercial and non-commercial, and the sort of geopolitical dimension of this is so complex. It really, I think, troubles existing regimes that operate along those categories.
I think it's really important. This context is to show really how complex this is and what a spectrum of behavior there is. So we've certainly got like all the way up to, we've got Adobe actually licensing the rights for all of the content that it's used to train its model in the new Photoshop. Although even that is pretty dodgy, because if you look that they just got all of the providers of the stock photos to sort of agree to this small print, and they're not actually paying them yet, although they're assuring them they will find out a way to pay them in the future. That's the best case, which is probably still not that great. And then you've got this whole spectrum of behavior, including some quite bad actors. And there's the question of how long it's going to take for these questions to sort of play out in the courts. And given the speed at which this is moving, if we're talking about 8 or 10 years to get some kind of resolution on some of these cases in some jurisdictions, then there's going to be a lot of change that's going to happen by then, and society will already have changed. So that's the sort of the background context that we wanted to give you. And the TLDR is, wow, it's really complicated. But perhaps now we could drill down into some of those really interesting questions that we've started alluding to. And Jane, you talked about one that I know that you're really fascinated by, and that is, what are the circumstances in which these outputs, so say we've got Memo's work is one output, that's at one end of the spectrum. You just putting a very simple prompt into Midjourney might be another end of the spectrum. What do you think is, what fascinates you about this, and where are you kind of falling?
Well, as a copyright geek, the advent of generative and artificial intelligence, particularly in the image context, really makes one go back to very first principles and think about what is a work of authorship, what does it mean to be an author? Who is there an author in the simple Midjourney or DALL-E context where you put in a prompt? And I would agree that Memo's work is at the other extreme, because he has created, he has not only caused the output, but he has also created or sufficiently intervened in the inputs that that we can say that he has both creative conceptualization and control over the output. Not total control, but we've never required in copyright law that to be an author there can be no random element to your creativity. Right? If we thought that
would be impossible, wouldn't it?
Right. Well, there would be, just to think of, say, Jackson Pollock. I don't think anybody disputes that he's the author of his splatter paintings, but I'm not sure that one could contend that every blob of paint was placed there.
Well, he co-authored them with Gravity.
Right. So some level of randomness, I think, is you can incorporate randomness as long as you control the overall design. And this issue is not new to artificial intelligence. There was a well-known and somewhat controversial case in the United States about a sculpture of wildflowers, and the question was whether if the wildflowers naturally arose, could the artist who claimed that he had created the color patterns generated by the flowers, was he the author, or was Mother Nature the author? And one could have different views about how the court should have appreciated the facts, but the basic dispute was there a controlling human being, or was the entire process of creation too random? Right? And there was no digital anything in that situation. But we can learn from that situation when we try to then think what what lessons can we draw from that to translate into the digital context?
Yeah, and at the other end of the spectrum, I suppose, Jane just reminded me, I guess it was in New York last year when I pulled out my laptop and we played with DALL-E. It was the first time for you. What did we make? You remember, I don't know how you remember all of these things.
Right, well, we asked for a man holding a bouquet of roses in a bathroom against turquoise tile. So that was a slightly elaborate prompt, but not hugely elaborate. And what was very interesting about the output was that we got 4 30-year-old white males holding bouquets of red roses, right? And we didn't say white male, and we didn't say red roses, but I guess on the probabilities, rose is associated with red. And as for why all white males, I think that's
a question we're all asking, Jane.
Bias, right? The world's bias makes its way, not surprisingly, into the data set. So it's garbage in, garbage out.
And so, yeah, really interesting to think about the degree of human expression and the degree of contribution. And as these systems provide more opportunity for us to like fine tune our results, so Midjourney, how many people here have played around with Midjourney? Yeah, and so you can, you get, 4 outputs. You're going to be, no matter how complex your prompt, you're still going to be pretty surprised by what you get, like very often. But then the more ability you've got to kind of fine tune it from there, and the more control you've got, I think that the more we get into that sort of territory. I think one of the things when we talk about siloing, I also sort of think about the dangers of one size fits all approaches to treating this. And Joel, I wanted to ask you about that. What do you think about generative AI in terms of how it might play out differently for different kinds of art forms? What should we be thinking about? What should be on the radar?
Yeah, well, I think this also segues from the question of authorship, because authorship means something different in the context of different disciplines with their, aesthetic, social and political traditions and legacies. And authorship in contemporary art, in the case of Memo's work, is sort of a very specific kind of authorship. The genius artist. There's a whole institutional apparatus of the art world that is sort of constructed around a recognisable author of a work and the form of sort of attribution that entails. So, in a way, this idea of singular authorship is actually essential for the art world and its regimes of value to function. Having said that, there's a long history of artists' artworks and movements that trouble the idea of the singular author, that delegate, performance to other actors, distribute authorship in all sorts of ways, anonymous collectives that produce work, etc. And then, thinking with other disciplines like music, for instance, where there are traditions of sampling, hip hop, plunderphonics, musical forms like techno that thematize mechanization, the challenge that, let's say, the drum machine poses to the drummer at a particular moment in time with this sort of mechanization of human labor. In photography, I think it plays out very differently. There was a recent controversy about a Midjourney generated image winning a photography prize. And the controversy was not so much about, the quality of the image or how compelling it was to look at, but whether it sort of counts as a photograph, even though it was trained on millions of photographs and it appears to be a photograph, superficially, the mode of production is not what we have understood as photography. So for the field of photography, and awards are quite important because they sort of are the space traditionally where what is included and excluded from a field is sort of contested. In art forms, the role of the avant-garde is always to sort of press up against the limits of a field. So it's quite important what counts or doesn't count within a field for, photography as a practice. So then I think about theatre and performance. The mental exercise that I've been doing, and not to mention writing with ChatGPT, literature and creative writing, again, comes with all of its own nuances. And we recently had Ted Chiang in the New Yorker saying that ChatGPT is a blurry JPEG of the internet. And he was describing those hallucinations that you mentioned, Jake, bullshit or sort of elaborate untruths that ChatGPT generates as as the equivalent of compression artifacts in a JPEG. It's low fidelity writing, but different disciplinary perspectives offer a very different sort of view on what's happening there. The mental exercise I've been doing is imagining some curators in an institution 20 years from now, in 2043, curating an exhibition of generative AI art from the early 2020s, right? And they're thinking about how do we historicise this work? Was it the continuation of something, the beginning of something new? What are the aesthetic paradigms? What are the kind of this moment of sort of wonder and curiosity that we're in? How does that play out? And what sort of looks naive? What looks optimistic? And where does it go?
If I can jump in, you want to jump in first?
Please.
A couple of things. That the photograph that won the prize, he then tried to register it for copyright with the Copyright Office, and the application was rejected for lack of human authorship, because his authorship consisted of giving repeated prompts to Midjourney, but he didn't control what Midjourney would give him. Midjourney would give him a number of options, and then he would pick among. And so I like this one.
The prompt on its own isn't enough to constitute authorship.
Well, a collection of prompts arguably might be a literary work, but
or even one sufficiently developed prompt, but it's not going to result in protection of the photograph.
Because you don't. If you give the same prompt, you don't get the same thing every time. That's the part of the control problem. And as for, could we say that there's authorship if Midjourney every time gives you 4 possibilities and you say, I like that one, or I want to work from that one? And that I think gets back to one of the fundamental differences between the art world and the copyright world when we talk about what do we mean by originality and creativity. So Marcel Duchamp is very famous for a bunch of things, and one of them is his ready-mades, right? Where he went out and I guess the most famous one is so-called fountain. He took an actual urinal and he put it on a pedestal, and he signed it with a pseudonym. And I gather this is a watershed moment in the art world. And for copyright, it's an absolute zero, because he didn't create the urinal. If he had made his own replica of a urinal, then he would have created
But there are
something.
many versions of Duchamp's urinal that have since been produced and exhibited.
But if you take the actual object that you didn't make, right, or you take the bicycle wheel and you put it on a stool, right, all of those things, his whole point was that he was taking things from the real world and giving them a new context, setting them in a different context. And that may indeed be a stride forward, but from the point of view of copyright law, it's an idea. Right? And
It doesn't constitute authorship.
We don't protect ideas. Right?
Yeah,
So-
Jake, can we go to you? Your thoughts?
I mean, my thoughts here were largely along the same lines, in the sense that each genre, each domain is going to have its own conventions and regimes of evaluation around what it means for the skill of production, be it computer programming, graphic design, photography, making music, to be reduced to a process of natural language prompting. To me, that's actually a really significant shift, in that the technical ability that we might often connect with authorship is no longer necessary when you can do it through natural language. I think it's actually a really interesting phenomenon with respect to generative AI more broadly, in the sense that the sort of history of AI is so connected to questions of natural language processing. So many developments happened in the context of natural language processing. And it was really in the 70s, in research done by IBM, that the current paradigm of machine learning, where you just throw more data at it, that's what's going to make it work, happened in the natural language processing context. And there was this interesting moment in which the content, like what we understand to be natural language, became a computational question of statistics. And now all of a sudden we're in this moment where what it means to produce anything has become a question of a sort of statistical interpretation of natural language. And so the prompt is this kind of weird artifact of that dialectic, and its relation to what were the skills necessary to produce those things before this paradigm, I think is really important to the question of, is it original? Is it authorship? Is it unique? Is it anything at all?
And Jake, can I stay with you for a moment? Because I'd like to tease out a little bit about your thinking around the sort of political economy of AI regulation, which is another really important facet to bring in while we're crossing these silos. And particularly how it might affect the business models of cultural production. We've got these free tools, subscription tools, the companies that make them, we've got how they're made, we've got the liability issues that then can affect what's in the sandbox that people are playing with in the first place. Do you want to speak a little bit about that and what that might mean for the future of culture? Another just little question. I mean, just save the little ones for Jake.
It's so complex, and there's a lot of really great work happening now looking at how various business models in this space intersect with the different lobbying efforts and the different trajectories that regulation around AI might take. We've had Europe sort of developing an artificial intelligence act to address, effectively impose compliance obligations premised on the degree of risk of any AI application that's been developing for some time. And when the sort of ChatGPT moment, they had to scramble to think about how this would work in the context of things like general purpose artificial intelligence models, foundation artificial intelligence models. And then we had the boss of OpenAI say something like, our technology is just so dangerous. Right, it's it needs to be regulated just because it's so dangerous. And I think as soon as something like that happens, you have to start thinking, okay, what are the angles here? Okay, why would a big commercial player like OpenAI, who's partnered with Microsoft, for instance, say we want to be regulated? What's the advantage there? What are they selling? And what kind of regulation might they be interested in? So they're selling like a big corporate, pay your $200,000 a year subscription for our suite of generative products, right? So they don't want anyone else to necessarily be able to replicate what they've got. So they're making other strategic statements like, oh, we don't worry about data anymore. Data, that paradigm of training AI models is over. It's all synthetic data now. So the thing that we did that was more or less illegal, don't worry about that. And no one else should worry about that either. On the other hand, you have open source generative AI models, right? So big companies like Meta, who saw the challenge from Google and the OpenAI Microsoft collaboration, decided we're not going to sell our own subscription-based open generative AI product. We're just going to give it all away. We're going to make an open source product. Now, this replicates a lot of business models that have existed in the platform world for a long time. You get developers building things on top of your open source software so that it integrates with your environment and your platform really well. But they're saying like, well, effectively they're trying to sync the OpenAI and Google business model. So how does Microsoft retaliate? They say, okay, we'll indemnify you for copyright liability if you use our model and our content filters. But if you use open source and open filters, then you're exposed to liability. So there's this back and forthing around the way in which you might strategically yield the threats of regulation in order to give particular business models competitive advantage.
And of course, this is something that Corey and I wrote about in Choke Point Capitalism. We talked about the ways in which corporations use regulation to entrench those competitive advantages, to choke point their markets. And there's a real risk of that today. And even if we think about some of the implications of varying interpretations of the law. So say, for example, what we come up with on the input stage is to say, well, all training data needs to be licensed. YouTube immediately is in a wonderful position because in its fine print, with all of those videos that have been uploaded to it, it insisted on taking really broad rights that would give it the ability to control that. And then, so Google then, or via YouTube, controls that market, and we see that there's these other potential choke points that could be created too. So really thinking more broadly about like those implications of the different options, and also thinking about the kind of world that we want to live in. If we are going to have these technologies, is it one where we want to have them concentrated in a small number of hands, where they get to take advantage of sort of what's, very often with these large data sets, they're taking very close to sort of the full output of humanity's creativity and knowledge, and then just channeling that into the benefit of a small number of investors.
But this is dynamic as well, because Reddit got very upset that they had their sort of whole history scraped to train ChatGPT. So they responded by increasing the price of API calls, right? So now no one else can necessarily do that without a huge amount of capital. So what's going to happen are competitive cooperations between large companies and platform providers who have been able to aggregate all this data that's useful to those other companies, and they're going to form sort of financial partnerships around the controlling flows of data, like we've seen in the platform world already.
I was going to say this means you, because if you have ever put anything up on an Instagram public page or YouTube or basically any of those platforms, you probably didn't read the terms and conditions, but the terms and conditions in most of those cases, Twitter as well, entitle them to allow third parties to exploit that those images, that text, etc. So while there is a fair amount of unlicensed stuff that has gone into the data sets, there's a very large amount of stuff that was licensed from you, but you didn't know it.
Mm. And when we think about where these technologies are coming from, I said very blithely at the start, they're not going to become sentient, they're not going to be taking half of all jobs. But these technologies are being funded largely by venture capitalists whose interest is to separate ever more value from labor towards capital. They're not setting out with the aim of making the world better. And so they are going to be disruptive to labor markets. And one of the things they are going to do, I think, is make work worse. So in the creative sphere, if we look at illustrators or script writers, things like that, by taking away some of the core part of the job, it makes it possible to hire somebody with less skill and less power to do the last bit of the job. So if you can get an okay starting image using prompts on Midjourney and then hire a very low-level graphic designer to fix it, then you don't have to pay the kind of rates that you give an illustrator who's got decades of experience and who would actually spend time and put care into it. And then we will gradually get used to a lower level of image, the same way as we've gradually got used to, and I think it was Molly Crabapple who gave this example, lower quality of architecture. I think as well that we've been talking a lot about the legal questions, whether this is possible, whether it contravenes the law. But I think we could also ask the broader questions of, even if it doesn't, do we want this kind of technology anyway? If we think about, maybe we could talk about that. What do you think, Joel, might be the implications if we continue on this path at the moment? Do you have any thoughts about the implications for working artists in that sort of, for example, the illustrator space?
I think it's unresolvable contradictions, really. We're all labouring under sort of these, I think, absolutely contradictory trajectories and positions. So I think about, some artists who are prominent in the sort of field of AI art, for instance, Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, two musicians who work with computer music, who are very active in this field. And, they have created a platform which is one of many artist-led platforms intervening in this field in a political ways. Theirs is called Have I Been Trained? And it's an interface where you can go and you can upload an image you've created, and the software will look for that image in the training data sets of these, image generating algorithms, and then help you make the request to have that image removed from those data sets. And then at the same time, this is not at all a contradiction, it's continuous in many ways. Holly Herndon, who is a fantastic vocalist with a very distinctive voice, has created a kind of digital twin that she calls Holly Plus, which is a version of her voice, a kind of clone of her voice that she is allowing people to freely use in their own music, with a kind of arrangement in which, if that work you produce creates profit, that is shared between her and the artist. So there are these attempts by artists to, in a way, hold these contradictions in place through work that sits with the strangeness of this moment, sits with the disruption of these modes of production, and kind of, asks us to kind of stay with the trouble, as it were, of the AI generation, and not try to, regulate it, or think that the sort of regulatory frameworks will provide an answer that, in a way, sort of comes before the cultural sort of use. So it's a bit of a long-winded way of saying, I think many artists will embrace these technologies in highly experimental and unforeseen ways, and hopefully in ways that help us understand sort of more reflexively what this new mode of production is, and sort of what and where it's going. I'm broadly optimistic in a way, partly because I think we've got no other choice.
Yeah, I was really struck by something I read a few weeks ago. Somebody fairly dismissively suggesting that artists need to stop complaining because they're just like the buggy whip manufacturers. So they've been replaced now. They've been superseded by this new, better technology, which really ignores the fact that, again, if we use the context of image generators, that they only work because of that corpus of human creative labour that's been fed in to train them in the first place.
Huge amount of labour that goes into like making the outputs acceptable for consumption. Like generative, like post-model labour. There was a recent article suggesting that there's now 1 million people doing data annotation for these systems. So just the amount of labour that's going into these
artificial intelligence.
These automation programs. Not to mention the just incredible amounts of capital necessary for them to be trained and work, and the amount of capital concentration that leads to, and the ecological consequences of effectively using up all the world's compute all the time. Like, we're actually in conditions where now there's not enough like industrial scale computation to go around, is kind of staggering consumption of resources to produce these things. Whether or not like it's cool art, I don't know.
I was just going to say that sort of curating of the outputs in order to make them sort of acceptable for consumption, I think that's something that a lot of artists will find extremely frustrating, that in a way the sort of limits of what counts as an acceptable image or what is sort of legible as a voice, let's say in voice reproduction or in music, that those limits are being sort of set in a normative way before you even get to kind of experience and work with them. And so the more kind of, let's say narrow the sort of parameters are for what is, counted for what is allowed to pass through, then the more incentive there'll be for artists to find alternative systems, alternative modes of production that kind of work around those limits.
Yeah, and this all sort of feeds into something I was thinking about recently when I was thinking about the technical ways in which these various systems work. And in a way, when you think about a model being trained, so it's ingesting the training data, well, so that's really closely analogous to us as humans who go to school and we read books and we learn about things, we're exposed to things, and then once we've read those, we've ingested them, our model is learned, and then we go off and create our own outputs. And so you might go to art school, for example, and then you are producing your own outputs that are influenced by the training data you have ingested, i.e. you learned about Duchamp, for example. And what I was thinking about was, well, what is the difference, though, between a machine learning it in that context and a human learning it in the different context? And is there a difference? And I haven't got it really clear in my mind yet what it is, but I am sure that there is one. And when we think about these issues, and we haven't even really sort of touched upon some of the really personal ones, so the things like what happens when you've got voice models that can put words in your own mouth, and we've got image models that can make your bodies do things that you haven't agreed to. I think that this raises really, really important questions as well about what are the differences between humans and machines, and what is due to us as humans? What kind of world do we want to live in, even if it is that it's becomes legally possible to do all of these things and potentially make it so that we don't have work for many kinds of creative worker anymore. Do we want to live in that world? We don't have time to solve that one tonight, but we will wrap up here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming along, and to our guests and to all of the organisers, Angela and her team, for helping us put this event together. Hopefully those silos have been crossed in a way that you found useful.